Chapter 7. I felt a spike of sudden energy surge through me as if all my exhaustion had vanished. I dropped everything and raced out the door to my car. Diving into it, I tore out of the apartment complex and drove straight out of Lanston, towards home as fast as I could. But as fast as my vehicle could take me, it was no match for the speed of my mind as it raced while I was frantically trying to determine just what could have happened. The voicemail didn't tell me much, other than the fact that something had happened to Bradley, and he needed me to come back right away. The fact that it had obviously happened 6 hours ago led me to fear that I would already be too late to do anything. Whatever condition he was in currently, I prayed that my brother could hold out for another 2 hours until I could get home. I finally pulled up in the neighborhood at 2 in the morning. Most of the lights in the house were still on, indicating that the mysterious event was depriving my family of sleep. I burst through the door and ran into the kitchen where Mom was sitting at the table, conversing with the doctor over a pot of coffee. Mom wasn't surprised to see me barge in and didn't even scold me for showing up so late. She was too busy grieving to get angry. I asked her what was going on, but she instantly started to cry. I raised my voice and demanded to know where Bradley was, but she didn't answer. I turned to the doctor, who informed me that Bradley was upstairs in his room. Without another word, I dashed out of the kitchen and rocketed up the stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. Sharply turning the corner and sprinting down the hall, I finally reached Bradley's room. Dad was by Bradley's bedside, caressing my brother's hand. He stepped aside when he noticed my entrance. I dropped down to Bradley's side and my fears quickly subsided, but not entirely. Bradley was still very much alive, but he was gravely ill and had been resting in bed all night, though refusing to fall asleep. My poor brother was fighting sleep for 8 hours straight, holding out faith that I would come eventually. I called his name quietly, despite being short of breath from my reckless dashing around the house. Bradley looked at me, but had to squint for a few seconds before he recognized me. Fatigue was swarming over his head like a storm cloud, and his vision must have been blurred from staying awake for so long. Bradley gathered as much energy as he could to sit up and greeted me with a hug with as much enthusiasm as he could give. He tried to shout, but a nasty coughing fit prevented him from speaking his mind. Dad left the room to refill Bradley's water glass. I told Bradley not to push himself so hard and eased him into a gentle whisper. "I knew you would come, Stephen," he said to me. "Of course I did. That's what brothers are for," I replied. I asked Bradley what happened to him, and though he tried to explain it as best he could, the doctor must not have told him everything. According to my brother's description, what started out as a simple cold worsened over the course of a day and a half. Bradley was experiencing ailments all throughout his body. A chronic headache that induced disorientation and impaired his vision slightly, a sore throat that prevented him from speaking louder than a whisper, else he'd suffer a horrible coughing fit, a throbbing pain in his chest that made his breathing hoarse and inconsistent, and a numb feeling in his legs. I took one look at his pale face and wanted to cry just looking at how miserable Bradley looked. His eyes were on the verge of shutting completely as my brother desperately fought back sleep. I helped him drink some water and pacified my brother by assuring him that everything would be fine. I was there at his side and had no plans of going anywhere until he was better. Bradley mentioned the escape plan set for tomorrow, but I delayed it indefinitely. There was no way I could get him out of the house in his current condition. I urged Bradley to get some sleep now that I had arrived, but something else was troubling him. He shifted over in his bed and made room for me to lie down next to him and talk until he could fall asleep. Nothing would have made me happier. I tried to keep the conversation short since it was getting hard for him to talk, but what he said next broke my heart into a million pieces. I looked into Bradley's eyes as they began to water and asked him what was wrong. "I don't want to go, Stephen. I want to stay with you. Forever." At first I was confused by what he told me. "Silly kid. You're not going anywhere. You're too sick to leave this bed at all," I explained to him, but Bradley didn't say anything more. Tears continued to roll down his cheeks, and I could hear him whimper faintly from the pain in his throat. The actual meaning behind his words struck me hard at that moment, and a grave chill slithered up my spine. "Don't ever say that. You're gonna be okay, I promise. We'll get through this together, and you'll be back to normal in no time." I spoke entirely from my gut. I don't know if Bradley really believed me or not, and I couldn't come up with anything else to add. Bradley's idea had spooked me too much to think rationally. Before our conversation could go any further, Mom appeared at the doorway and asked calmly to speak to Bradley alone. I didn't think much of the request, assuming it would only be a few minutes, so I got up from Bradley's bed and exited the room. Half an hour passed and Mom finally emerged, turning off Bradley's light. She brushed right past me, immensely sobbing as she descended the staircase. I re-entered Bradley's room, but I assumed he was asleep. I heard a very faint whisper in the darkness, beckoning me to lie down with him. I lied right down next to my brother, and he hugged me tightly as he fell asleep. "I love you, Stephen," I heard him whisper to me. "I love you too, Bradley. So much." The two of us drifted off to sleep together. Bradley's words still had me on edge, but I tried to remain optimistic as best I could, and fell asleep by dreaming of all the good times we had together in our lives leading up to that moment. Morning came, sooner than I wanted it to, but I quickly gave in to the sun's demands and sat up. Bradley was lying next to me, but was still fast asleep. I nudged him gently and whispered his name. I wanted to see if he was feeling any better that morning, but he didn't budge at all. I laid my head on his chest, and my anxiety from the night before returned tenfold. I couldn't sense Bradley's heartbeat. I began to shake Bradley more profusely as I was engulfed with terror. "Oh God, please no! Bradley! Bradley, you've got to wake up! Please! Please, Bradley, come on! You have to wake up!" I held him tightly in my arms as I rocked back and forth. At that moment, I cried harder than I ever knew I could. I was consumed with hysteria, and I refused to accept the prospect that Bradley could really be gone. My parents and the doctor entered the room when they heard my shouting. 2 tall men dressed entirely in black stepped in as well, and took Bradley from me. I knew they were here to take my brother away, but I just couldn't fathom it happening so soon. Time was just moving too fast for me as I struggled to get a hold of myself. I was desperate for answers. How had everyone else already known about Bradley's passing before me? As it turns out, the doctor was the first to make the discovery. He came to check on Bradley earlier that morning and failed to find a pulse. He estimated that the virus in his body had spread to his heart over the course of the night, and it proved to be too much for my brother's body to handle. So, in his sleep, Bradley just let go. I fought the diagnosis, arguing that Bradley would never give up, that he was too strong to just quit, but there was no point in fighting it any further. My worst nightmare had come true. Bradley was gone, and I was alone. I felt hopeless and terrified without him. A funeral was held for my brother the next day in a cemetery not far from home. All of our neighbors and Bradley's classmates attended. I was asked to deliver a speech, and I reluctantly accepted. It was hard to find the proper words, but I poured my soul over that podium, all the while trying to stop myself from crying. Not that I was embarrassed to break down in front of an audience. They understood my pain and sympathized, as for such a solemn occasion calls. No, I didn't want to cry because I was still struggling to accept the reality of it all. I didn't want any of this to be real. I felt as though I were trapped in a nightmare and was desperate to wake up. But the day dragged on for an eternity. I couldn't accept that Bradley had really left me. This was the end of the road for him. It wasn't fair. My little brother was so young. He still had so much to live for. So why now? How could they take him away from me so soon? I felt a grueling pain in my chest as reality stabbed me with all the time that passed away with Bradley. He would never celebrate another birthday. We would never spend another Christmas or summer together. I would never get to watch Bradley as he grew up. He would never graduate or move on to a fulfilling career. I would never see him fall in love just as I had with Monica, and I would never see him get married. He wouldn't be the best man at my wedding either. All I had left of him was the past. Suddenly, I remembered our time together as kids, and I experienced a newfound hatred towards myself. All those years I had yelled at him or shoved him away. All he ever wanted was to show me what happiness felt like. Maybe he saw that I was such an emotional mess deep down, and he just wanted to prove to me that everything would be okay. I believe my brother had my best interest at heart all along. How could I have been so heartless to him? I didn't feel worthy of being brothers with someone who cared for everyone else more than himself. I was disgusted at the very thought of how I acted back then. We could have been good friends for so much longer if I hadn't been so stubborn. So many potential years lost. Now, there was no future for my brother, and that was a future I wanted no part of. I wanted Bradley to always be there for me, right up until the very end. I wanted to die with him at my side, but the tables had been turned. He died at mine. But the thing I knew I would miss the most was his smile, the kind of grin that you couldn't help but cherish. Bradley always smiled whenever he saw me, and no matter how I felt at the time, I couldn't help but smile back. But I had no reason to smile anymore. I felt so lost. I didn't know how to feel anything other than pain. The rest of the world around me was just so meaningless. It was as if all of my hope, everything I had ever cherished in this world, all of my heart and my feelings were just disintegrating into smoke under the fires of my frustration and despair. I wanted to crawl inside myself and pray for all the sorrow to leave me, knowing full well it wouldn't. Each of the attendants complimented my speech at the end of the funeral and paid their condolences respectively as they left. I didn't pay much attention, however, much less make eye contact with any of them. That entire day, the only person whom I felt comforted by was myself, and at the same time I was so angry at myself for taking advantage of the little time I actually had with Bradley. Life as I knew it was just becoming too much of a burden. I retreated into the sanctuary of my subconscious, but I knew I would have to snap out of my blind trance soon enough. I wanted more than anything to just give up, to just abandon this life I knew. I lost sight of my purpose for being here. Any dreams I'd ever had for the future, they meant nothing to me now. It was as if my entire being was just shattering endlessly into smaller and smaller pieces as they smashed upon the floors of reality. I was alone now, truly alone. There wasn't a soul that walked the earth who could truly understand how I felt at that moment. As soon as my parents and I returned to the house, I went straight up to Bradley's room to take one last look around. I never paid much attention to what Bradley's room had looked like until now, aside from occasional quick peeks. The walls were painted with a gentle olive green, just as they had always been. I looked at Bradley's empty bed and remembered the tiny crib that had occupied its place 9 years ago. I shifted my attention to Bradley's surprisingly tidy desk. It had never looked so organized when I was around. Mom must have cracked down on him to keep it clean. Now it almost looked out of place in Bradley's room. I could still vision the antique rocking chair that preceded the desk. I could always take one peek into Bradley's room from a distance and instantly see Mom sitting in the chair, rocking him gently back and forth until Bradley fell asleep. The last piece of furniture came as a slight surprise to me. I spotted my old toy box that was a staple of my own bedroom for countless years. I handed down so many of my toys to Bradley that I stopped playing with as I got older, and I eventually gave him the box itself. It slowly emptied as time went by when Mom donated the toys Bradley stopped playing with. My brother had been 9 years old now, and while he still had a few toys left, they were the minority of the toy box's contents. Now there were books and art supplies since he enjoyed drawing often, in addition to my old Lighter Eyes comic book stack. I didn't even know my brother had started reading them. Bradley's beloved stuffed dinosaur was also banished to the toy box. I think he must have been too embarrassed to carry it around, but wouldn't dare to part with it. I slowly exited Bradley's room, closing the door behind me. As I walked down the hall, I looked back at the door. I tried to fool myself into thinking Bradley was still in there, that he was just asleep and that one day he might wake up, open the door, and rejoin me so we might seize the day again, just as we had always had. But I knew deep down that that day would never come. and I didn't want to admit it to myself. But it helped me slightly to believe such a fantasy. Now that I saw how cruel the world can be as to take someone away from you, I almost didn't want Bradley to come out, in a sense. As long as that door was closed, Bradley would remain safely inside, protected from this cruel and unforgiving world. I decided to leave home right away. The onslaught of nostalgia was too much for me to handle. I exited the house quickly and drove back up to Lanston, not even saying goodbye to my parents. I wasn't fazed when thinking about my actions because I was just too occupied with other thoughts. I barely noticed the drastic change in weather as I pulled into Lanston that afternoon. Instead of the usual clear skies, the city was facing heavy showers. Normally, I hated driving in the rain, but it seemed appropriate to me that day, so I ignored it. I arrived at my apartment, but had no energy to do anything, as if all the life had been drained from my person. I crawled into my bed and slept the rest of the day and through the night. I woke up late the next morning, feeling sick to my stomach and exhausted. The strange symptoms I felt persisted for the rest of the day and into that night after. I simply ached and had no energy at all, despite all the sleep I had been getting. The following day, I decided to see a doctor and was diagnosed with a minor form of depression. I was sent home with a prescription, but after the first dose failed to change anything, I stopped taking them. I continued to pick up the weekly prescriptions to make it look like the pills were working, but I just let them gather up on my kitchen table. I started to eat much less than I usually did because I never had an appetite, and lost 10 pounds as a result. I would take one look in the mirror and stare intently at my pale skin and bloodshot eyes. My lips were chapped, as if I had never smiled once in my life. My depression soon worsened and began to affect more aspects of my life. Before I knew it, I hadn't left my apartment actively in 2 weeks. I missed the registration deadline for the new semester and basically dropped out of college. Monica took notice of my suspiciously withdrawn behavior after I failed to return her calls. She didn't like us spending so much time apart from each other and started visiting me on a regular basis. During that time, she tried to talk me into moving on from Bradley's death, but I just couldn't motivate myself to do so. She tried everything she could to bring the old Stephen back, but to no avail. Monica was growing frustrated with her failed attempts to reach me, and with my delusional mind, I was beginning to see her as more of an annoyance than a friend reaching out. We began to argue, and the tension only grew worse until finally, Monica and I broke up and refused to speak anymore. My depression had consumed me and deprived me of my passion for Monica and for life itself. She had felt abandoned. I didn't chase after her, not because I didn't care for her, but because I knew she was right. I had become a shell of my former self. Everything I loved most was vanishing right before my eyes, so I tried to accept it as a twisted routine in my life. I began to question what the point was of having connections to other people at all, if they could just leave you so easily. Everything I had learned from Bradley, all the wonderful experiences I shared with him, I was beginning to forget what they were like, having felt nothing but sorrow for months after his passing. Just when I was convinced my life couldn't get any worse, a package arrived at my door one day that took everything I knew and felt in a completely different direction. It was a small brown box that was relatively light. The return address was home. What could it be? I thought it was my hat or watch that I must have left during my abrupt return home. Not that any personal trinkets I might have left behind meant much to me anymore. There were 3 items in the box, the first of which was a letter written by my father, describing the other contents. I began exploring the package by reading the letter first. Stephen, I'm sending you this package because there are some things I want you to have, and there's something important you need to know. I looked into the box before reading further and found Bradley's stuffed dinosaur, a paper rolled up and held in place with a rubber band, and some sort of document originating from the local hospital back home. I continued reading Dad's letter. I thought you should hold on to Bradley's dinosaur since your mother wants to burn it. She can't stand to look at it anymore because it reminds her of Bradley. It's better off in your possession, I figure. The scroll is something Bradley wrote the day before you came down to visit. He wrote it especially for you and wanted me to make sure you got it. I don't know what it says, so I'll leave that up to you to take a look for yourself. Seeing Bradley's dinosaur instantly opened a fresh wound for me. I couldn't bring myself to open the scroll, so I tossed it under my bed, trying to erase it from my memory. I meant to give you these items when you were in town, but you left the house in such a rush. Can't say that I blame you for leaving so quickly, son. Bradley's death has hit all of us pretty hard, and we need to cope with it at our own paces in our own ways. Father Time is the only one who can help us heal now. I took a closer look at the special hospital document, but I couldn't understand what Dad was trying to tell me about it, so I read the rest of the letter to make sense of it. The final item is a medical record from the hospital. Their system generates one of these documents for every single patient that has received treatment there. The document you have there is Bradley's medical record. It was created the morning Bradley was born and contains classified information regarding a secret condition he had. You have no idea how many hoops I had to jump through to obtain this information, so put it somewhere safe. I'm giving you Bradley's medical report because your brother had a certain condition that only your mother and the hospital were supposed to know about. But when I discovered it, I had to inform you as well. At the time of Bradley's birth, our doctor discovered that he had developed a fatal genetic disease. It's a disease that some family members on my side are born with, though it is rare and tends to skip generations occasionally. The sickness takes form at birth and slowly destroys the body by spreading to all major organs when it merges with other germs or viruses in the body. This disease takes years and years to spread on its own, without the added help of other viruses though, and the hosts typically live long enough that the disease doesn't take real effect until the host has aged considerably and has a weakened immune system. However, even a common cold can be lethal because it can accelerate the growth of the genetic disease. There has been no official cure found for this disease, but there has been an interesting discovery recently. There have been numerous studies that have shown a direct link between mental stability and the acceleration of the disease. The better the host feels mentally, the easier it becomes for their body to combat the disease. There have even been a few instances where people have managed to force the disease into subsiding to a non-threatening status. I know it sounds preposterous, but it's all true. I strongly believe Bradley had shown no signs of possessing the sickness during his early years simply because he was so happy with his life. But he was only truly happy because he had you, Stephen. You were his joy, and he always wanted you to be with him. I believe that you were the very aspect of Bradley's life that kept him alive. Your mother knew all about Bradley's condition and became frustrated that it was not her who was fulfilling Bradley's life. She believed it was her job as a mother to keep Bradley happy, and when she wasn't able to fulfill that, she began to lose sight of that goal. I watched how much time the two of you spent together, and I'm more confident now than I ever have been that Bradley loved you more than he could for your mother and me. I understood why that was, but your mother was infuriated by it. She tried so hard to repair her relationship with her son after you moved out that she hadn't even realized how miserable Bradley became. I think all the joy and confidence you gave Bradley built up immunity to his disease, but when your mother struck down upon him, it weakened him. His optimism deteriorated so much so to the point where a simple common cold became as deadly to him as it was. It brought me great pain to believe it, but I was convinced Bradley wasn't going to pull through. Then you showed up. Seeing you again must have boosted his confidence and gave him the strength he needed to recover from his symptoms. There's something I need to tell you now that you've read this far. If there's anything I want you to take away from this entire letter, then it's what I'm about to tell you. When your mother entered the room alone to talk to Bradley that night, she told Bradley of his condition and that she wasn't sure if he'd survive. She knew it would destroy his spirits, but she wanted him to know the truth, instead of dying oblivious. Your mother believed there was nothing else to say. She felt obligated as the mother to tell him, and therefore wouldn't have allowed you or me to interfere had we known what she was planning. Stephen, you mustn't blame yourself for Bradley's passing. You did more for him than anyone ever could hope to, and you have made me very proud. You were exactly the person Bradley needed in his life, and you made it worthwhile for him. I realize how difficult it has been all these years. I haven't helped or talked to you, and now this happens. It wasn't because I hated you or wanted to ignore you. It was because all your life I've watched you grow and mature. I stepped back because I believed you knew what was best for Bradley. I don't expect you to ever forgive me for abandoning you. All I want now is for you to know the truth about Bradley, the truth about that evening, and for you to be able to live happily with your memories of your brother instead of mourning over his departure. I know you're strong enough. Never forget who you are and what you're capable of. Sincerely, Dad. I felt a roller coaster of emotions as I read the letter, and by the time it concluded, I wanted to tear it up out of frustration. I couldn't believe what I had just read. Bradley was in danger of dying his entire life, and I had never known. Why had Mom never told me, or even Dad for that matter? Was she sworn to secrecy, or was she really just as every bit selfish as I had believed her to be? I was exploding with rage just thinking of my mother at that moment. She only treated Bradley so horribly because she viewed him as a prize to be won, with me as her competitor. The very idea sickened me. No wonder she and I always fought so much. The world around me grew dim, and I was beginning to lose my sense of reality, as if a dark, heinous energy was consuming my mind and coursing through my veins. If my father's description of the disease was as accurate as he claimed, then I could have saved Bradley. If he had remained by my side and I hadn't thrown him to the demon that was our mother, maybe he wouldn't have let go. The more I began to ponder the situation and the events of the fateful night, the more control I lost over all rational judgment. The guilt of letting Bradley fall victim to my mother was crushing me, and the rancor I felt towards her for destroying all of Bradley's hope grew stronger with every passing minute. As far as I was concerned, my mother had killed Bradley. He meant nothing to her anymore, so she casted the darkest possible nightmare upon him and forced my brother to lose hope. She locked me out of his life in an instant and deprived him of his will to live. Bradley should have never been told about such a condition, and the consequence was realized. I ran towards the kitchen table and grabbed a handful of the prescribed painkillers I neglected to take previously. The realization of all of this was just too much for me to take in. I shoved as many pills as I could down my throat in one large, painful swallow. I was desperate to contain my boundless hatred, pain, and sadness. Suddenly, I made up my mind in an instant. It all became clear what I wanted to do, having processed all of the information my father just gave me. I succumbed to the pools of rage inside me and proceeded to my bedroom, where I pulled out my father's handgun from the top drawer of my dresser. He had trusted me with it for self-defense purposes, but when I held the gun in my hand, I could only imagine a different purpose, a more suiting one. I wouldn't use the gun as a counter to fear, but rather as a delivery of justice. Bradley was the most important person in my life. He didn't have to die. My brother was never one to give in, no matter how grim the situation seemed, because he and I would face the odds together. I could have saved him that night if my mother had never told him the truth. I would have held his hand and urged him to remain strong. Maybe, just maybe, he could have overcome his condition and lived to tell the tale. All he needed was the hope, which I would have provided in spades. But no, my mother stepped in and obliterated everything he and I had built together. Without me, Bradley must have felt trapped and vulnerable to her wrath. It was too much for him. All my life, my mother was there making everything difficult for me. She could never accept my strengths and could never love me for who I was or who I grew up to be. I could have forgiven her now for all the meaningless arguments we had in the past, but not this time. Now she had gone too far. Taking Bradley away from me was the biggest mistake she'd ever made, and I was ready to prove it to her. I was prepared to kill her. I wanted her to suffer the way Bradley did when she told him he would die. I wanted her to taste all of my hatred, all of my sorrow and my despair. I was prepared to face the consequences of murder, if it meant erasing my mother from my life forever. Just as I made my way to the door, I stopped and took one look in the mirror. The intensity of my expression set me back, as I almost hadn't recognized the face that I saw. I could see the anger in my eyes and was terrified by it. It was almost as if the mirror had snapped me out of a trance. What was I doing? Was I really about to kill someone in cold blood over what was now a memory? No, it wasn't a memory. I could never associate that evening with anything that ever brought me joy. But it was still in the past. I still loathed my mother, but shooting her wasn't the answer. It wouldn't give me what I wanted most. All I wanted more than anything was Bradley to be alive again. No matter how much I wanted to kill my mother for what she had done to him, it wouldn't bring my brother back. The immense feelings of pain returned. I felt as though I were a captive of insanity, not knowing what to do next. I wasn't thinking clearly and latched onto the first idea that came to my mind. I looked down at the gun that I was still tightly gripping in my hand. Slowly, I lifted my arm and pointed the gun towards myself. I opened my mouth and placed the tip of the weapon inside. There was no force on this earth that could bring Bradley back, so I resolved to join him where we would be safe from the devils inhabiting the mortal world forever. I placed my finger on the trigger, ready to end it all. But before I could shoot, a strange sensation overwhelmed me. Suddenly I felt nauseous and disoriented as time and space came to a standstill. My vision blurred, my chest felt heavy. My arms became numb and my legs couldn't support my weight any longer. I fell backwards and hit the ground with an echoing thud. Was this the end? My entire life flashed before my eyes during my last few seconds of consciousness. Then, everything faded to black.